Good afternoon, Biba and Philip.
Good morning, Christopher.
And yeah, good morning, Christopher, and good afternoon, Philip. Today, on the brandLingual podcast, we are launching a new series called Expert Interviews. In these conversations, we will be speaking with experts from different fields to broaden both our perspectives and also yours. In this format, instead of focusing on the expert's personal journey, as we do in our Unlearned series, we place ideas and perspective at the center, as these are what truly matters or what truly makes each expert unique. Today, Christopher and I are joined by our guest, Philip Horvath, who choose a life path devoted to deep love of knowledge, even becoming a monk. And Philip's career has largely focused on developing leadership capabilities and bringing a wide range of innovation projects to life around the world. I might be romanticizing this, but it feels as if you are present at the moment of birth, helping ideas come into the world and take a shape. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. I think you could, thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I guess you could say I'm a midwife of the new, kind of on the one hand, deeply steeped in the past, looking at, along of the wisdom traditions of the world, some of them thousands of years old. And at the same time, having my foot in the future, I love reading sci-fi and learning about how people imagine what's going to be next. And so I'm kind of in this bridge between past and future, trying to really, for the most part, just be present to the moment, because I think really that's where the reality lives, is in this moment, right? All past exists only in my imagination, and all my future only exists in my imagination. And this here, right now, this moment with you, and this moment is the only thing that's really real and where I can do something. So, but I try and be a good midwife to this process of birthing. And I think we are between the old and the new right now, all of us. And we're feeling this transformation pretty heavily, I think. And a lot of people have that sense that, the world is broken or very insecure or very complex suddenly. And it's kind of always been that, but at the moment it's amplified. And I think we're all called to be midwives of the future at the moment.
This is a wonderful reminder of what you just said as to really one of the key reasons why we wanted to bring you onto the pod. And for those listening and are watching, we've spent time with Philip in other sessions and other conversations, one of which, in fact, we'll make available to you, which was previously streamed privately to the Strategy Pints community, but I think something you'll find a lot of inspiration in. But based on what Philip just said and what we experienced is this state of trying to deal with being between things and understanding how to translate between old worlds, new worlds, past, present, future, whatever it might be. And the transformation that can come through proper translation is something that we feel is very much a shared fascination. So we wanted to begin the conversation today, Philip, with really exploring this theme with you, a subject matter expert, we believe, on both transformation and translation. I wanted to hear your perspective on the kind of leader that is really needed to truly drive change, particularly in large groups of society, large organizations, and really in these complex and challenging times. What kind of personal qualities or inner structure does a leader need to have today?
And thank you for starting there, because I think it's important. And I think you're very much about that we define our terms, right? Because I think leader is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot. And, for the most part, we look at leaders as people in certain boxes in the org chart. We go to the root of the word. Leader comes from the English word ledere, and ledere means to be willing to go one step further, right? To cross a threshold, to go into the unknown, and ultimately, because of that, create a pathway. And I think for me, leaders come in very different forms, right? If you think about how culture or how society is created, it's created by leaders in the sense of artists, right? For me, artists are not really about making art. They're actually first and foremost about exploring what it means to be human in the current time, and the documentation of that process becomes their artifacts. Then you have entrepreneurs, people who create new startups, create new business solutions because they sense some new dynamic in the society or see some new technological development, and they build something from that. You have leaders in organizations, right, who are in our positions there, right, people who are simply choosing to go one step further than others, people around them. You have them in the form of activists, you have them in the form of teachers and educators. So really, for me, a leader is anybody who is willing to go there, right, willing to take that next step. And I think that's really the kind of leadership we're called to do right now, right? Because if you think about transformation, it's one of those in-between spaces too, right? Where the old is not quite serving us anymore. But in the last century, we had new perspective, we gained new awareness, both of the potential of becoming an individual, on the one hand, where the individual mattered more than even family. And on the other hand, we had suddenly this planetary perspective looking from above, right? So suddenly we see the Earth in 3D and we realize that there's no east or west or left or right, but it's really one, frail little blue ball in the middle of space. And, so in this in-between space as a result of it, because the old systems don't serve that any longer. But the new systems that would serve that are not quite here yet. Right? So there's middle transformation space, this liminal space, like they say, between the past and the future. And there's typically three ways to react to that. There's the people who want to go back, right, to some imagined past. Oh, it was all better in the past. Let's go back, let's go back, let's go back. Right, then there's the confused, anxious middle sitting there going, okay, this is all new and different. I don't know what to do yet. I'm going to wait for someone to tell me what to do. And then you have those few who have said, okay, cool. We don't know what's up. What do we want to create? Let's do this. Let's build the future. And for me, that's leadership. Right? And I think in your job in particular, as people who create brands, you are very, very important in this leadership, right? Because you're ultimately defining narratives for society. You're defining not just a brand, not just a product, but what does it mean? Right? What does it mean around it? What's the context of that product? What's the stories behind it? What's the kind of humans we are highlighting here? And you have some beautiful examples in the world of branding of how sometimes it's the evil brand that's just there to make the money, right? And poisons our bodies and poisons our rivers and uses our resources. And you have brands that are really trying to stand for something and trying to create a new world and really stand for that future. So in that sense, and I know there's a very long answer to your question, but really a leader for me is someone who's willing to go there, right? Willing to take one step further. And for me, that happens in three dimensions, really. It happens in your internal system, right? To really look at who am I and how can I continue to improve myself, right? And not with this, oh, I have to optimize myself, so I look at an Instagram, but really from the perspective of how do I create a meaningful, rich life, right? And rich in the sense of experiences and of connections and of the depth of experience that you have here. Right? So I think the first part of leadership is really leading yourself, right? And really looking at who do I want to become, who do I want to have been one day, right? Then there's leading in relationship with others, right? Where I look at any transaction that I have, any interaction I have, and I look at how can we both move away from this interaction enriched, right? Where we both gain from this experience. And then there's leading in the world, right? And really looking at what am I called to innovate here? What am I called to bring into being? Right? Because all of us are creators by default. Right? And most of us forgot that, and we just get stuck in little boxes and just do the things we're supposed to be doing. But we're all incredibly creative beings, right? And so what is it that you want to create here? And I think those are the three questions I would ask any leader, no matter where you are in an organization or even if you're a freelancer and on your own, is to say, how am I leading myself today? Right, so that I can have a really rich life, so that the 80-year-old version of me is proud and the 80-year-old version of me is proud, as Alan Watts said, right? How can I lead myself? How can I lead any encounter? And how can I lead in this world?
I think that we will also plug your fantastic article that you wrote this week and shared on your Medium. And I will just refer a little bit on your article in this context about being a leader. You wrote that for a leader to become truly a leader, you need to crack yourself open or to kind of, get a little bit of taste of life's medicine, as I like to call it. Otherwise, you don't have this some sort of experience and you can't actually kind of understand what does it even mean to be a leader. And yesterday, Christopher and I, we had a fantastic conversation. It will be in upcoming podcast interview with some woman who was also talking about her life's journey. And she said that she was like at her beginning of the career in almost like in the best place in the world, and then she kind of fall down into kind of like I don't want to say worst place in the world, but the place that challenged her a lot. And only through this kind of experience, by cracking herself up, she understood like what is what, like what experience means, like what is the value of each experience. And in the context about the leadership, I do believe that there is like big part of becoming a leader is to have these experiences. And that was part of your article.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said earlier, leadership means crossing a threshold. And so that's not a necessarily an easy thing to do. But if you think about life, ultimately life keeps growing, but then there's certain hurdles that come, and they keep us sort of where we're at, right? They keep this like the shell of the seed, right, that prevents the seedling from coming out, and so we need to crack that shell open. Right, in that sense, transformation is most of the time actually, and that makes it different from change because change happens all the time. Transformation is when we get to one of those thresholds and be like, ah, ah, right, we keep bumping against this until we really can't bear it anymore, and then crack open. Right, and oftentimes that happens involuntarily. If I think about my life, I mean, I've learned some of the most things about life and relating from my divorce, from losing my job when the dot-com world crashed back then, from being close to homeless and broke, and having to figure out where to sleep the next day. Those kind of moments were really hard. I mean, I had moments in my life where I was depressed and suicidal even. I mean, and those were ultimately the moments that made me who I am today. Right. And so I think this is the dark side of transformation, is that it is a bit of a death experience, right? For that seedling to come out, the shell has to crack. Right. And this is really where we have to give up our ideas of ourselves, or delusions of ourselves oftentimes, right? Where we have, because we grow up as kids and we're conditioned into this world and imprinted with all kinds of ideas about what the world is and who we are and what we're supposed to be. And if I think of myself as a noun, right, if I think Philip is this thing, nouns are pretty static. And this is where I like Buckminster Fuller's notion of I seem to be a verb, right? Because I'm not static, I'm always changing. But there are these moments when it's like, right, when we hit the wall, and then we keep repeating old patterns that necessarily don't serve us any longer. And until it gets too painful, or until, something is so exciting, we're not willing to change, or not willing to transform. Right? And this is really the two sides of the coin of transformation. Either it becomes too painful, or we have such a great aspiration for who we want to be that get us beyond these thresholds. Right? We have to have a reason to cross that threshold, because it's not necessarily an easy thing, and it is certain ego death that comes with it, right? And an identity death that comes with it. And we have to accept that, that's also part of it. Right? And really our relationship to death in general, I think, determines our relationship to life. Right? If we're afraid of death, then we also end up being afraid of life. Right? And if I'm afraid of life, I'm not going to be transforming. I'm going to stay in the safe world. Right? But that very commonplace, cliche of like the magic happens outside the comfort zone. Well, sometimes that comfort zone is really ingrained and embedded, and we have to really crack it open. And that can hurt as well.
I mean, it's interesting, this concept of ego death has actually come up once before in our interview with Heidi Hackemer, who suggested everyone should have an ego funeral and celebrate it. So it's interesting how we come back to this theme. I want to probe in on this, on leadership and inner work, because there's often always a very strong emphasis on the inner development, the self-awareness, reflection in leadership. But oftentimes, what we're being asked to do is like large scale change, right? Like something out away from the inner and more about all of these outer selves who all have their own inner selves, locked in systems with different competing incentive structures and constraints. Are we over indexing on the inner life of leaders and maybe underestimating the role of structure and environment in driving change among, say, large groups of people?
Well, absolutely. I mean, systems are much enforcements of what's happening, right? And if you think about, for me, systems ultimately a crystallization of our culture, right? How we interact with each other and how we do things around here, right? If I just do it initially, then it's just a one-off. But if I codify it, if I have a SOP around it, suddenly it becomes the system, right? This is how we do things around here, and it's codified and systemized, right? Which is the case in most organizations, right? This is really what builds an organization, is repeatable processes, right? So in that sense, a system is a crystallized structure of our culture, and culture is an epiphenomenon of how individuals show up. Now, if you now suddenly change, right, that doesn't mean that the whole system is going to change, right? Because the whole system is still wrapped in its own things. And you mentioned things like incentive structures, for example. If I don't address those, then I'm going to continue to incentivize old behaviors. And we've seen this right now, right? We've seen in a way, like a real split in organizations, and schizophrenia on the one hand, because on the one hand, there is this awakening, especially a couple of decades ago, that started with, self-awareness, new leadership things, new mindsets, new awareness, right? And we're still incentivizing the whole old behavior. And I've seen it so many times with leaders who are like going to a wonderful mindfulness seminar or something on the weekend, and they're having this revelation about how they're going to be this new person on Monday morning, right? And they go back to the office on Monday morning, and they're like, "Oh shit, my KPIs are not where they should be. So let's go to do our KPIs." Right? And then they go right back to old behaviors. Right? I've seen it so many times with leaders, and it's not that they're schizophrenic, or it's just simply natural that they, in the systemic context, fall back into old patterns. So this is why I think also, 70% or 80% of transformations typically fail. Right? On the one hand, I think that's actually because they miss the human side, and they just look at culture as a system, and then they put like nice posters on the wall that say, "Oh, we're a people company now," right? And they still behave and act the same way they used to before, right? Because they're not addressing the individual change. So it has to be a both and. And I think this is, like, from what I'm gathering, what you both are really about. It's a both and, right? There is both and. And even the article that you mentioned, by the way, was about the goddess Ishtar and the divine feminine. And one of the things that really is a big sign of it is that holding the paradoxes, holding the opposites, that both things can be true, right? That it's not either or. Well, this idea of either or is actually an emotional need for safety, right? Because we want to be safe, we want to know the right answer, right? And if in this whole world of rationality, we're like, you should just figure it out. And if you have enough titles, and if you've read enough books and have enough degrees, then you know the truth, right? But that's bullshit, right? Because really, in the end, nobody knows the truth, right? But this is it this or is it that thinking comes from this emotional need for certainty. And what really the next level of humanity, in my mind, is this relational self that can hold paradox, that can hold differences. Like, on the one hand, I'm trying to be a very good human being. On the other hand, I'm a complete idiot too. I mean, I'm still doing very stupid things every day, right? And it's important to not say I'm either okay or I'm not okay, but to say, well, I'm a multitude. Right? Like Walt Whitman, I think, said, am I contradicting myself? Of course, because I contain multitudes. I think this is so important as a capacity to be able to see both and hold both sides, right? The old and the new. The left side of the brain, with logic and linear systems, and the right side of brain with arty, creative intuition. Right? Both things are important, right? And it's not an either or. Neither one of them is the right way.
I do believe that it takes some sort of like a level of not the level, but some sort of time to work internally with yourself to achieve this state of mind. It doesn't happen like on day one when you are like starting to work in industry, or you are like, still a beginner in your career. You can only achieve this level after, I would say, years of practicing your thing and also by working with yourself. I just had a call with my mother this morning, and she was like, nobody is almost working with themselves and this level of thinking that actually I was talking with her in a private conversation. She was like, nobody is even thinking on this level. And I was like, we will have a conversation today with actually a monk. And in a context of being a monk, I think it's also very interesting what you mentioned about the paradox is that I do believe that people who are very focused on ego, and ego comes at the center or is the first, you can't keep open mind that there is this kind of like that you need to have this openness that there can be like two different sides of the coin. And in Buddhism, we know that the meditation goes up to this idea that you need to be non yourself or non self or non me. And I do believe that only in that state of mind, we can actually say that if you can achieve this level, then you can only talk about ego funerals or whatever the statements we are using to kind of pretend that we are taking the ego away. And I do believe that's a huge amount of work that we actually need to do to get to that level.
Absolutely. I mean, is one of the things that has given me great compassion and patience for the world, is this remembering that every individual starts from the beginning, right? In the way there's this saying that phylogeny mirrors ontogeny, or something like that, in the sense of, every individual has to go through all of evolution. But if you think about ourselves, we start as one cell, then 2 cells, then 4 cells, then 8 cells, and we become sort of plant-like in our mother's belly, and then eventually we crawl out and become little amphibians, and we learn how to walk and talk, and then we get imprinted with the current cultural operating system. And we kind of develop in these waves, right? In the first 7 years of our lives, we kind of just physically arrive here, more or less, right? And we've kind of activated all of our different circuitry, but we're kind of just about here. And then the second, 7 to 14, it's all about the emotions. And do I like this? Am I safe? Am I okay? Am I not okay? Am I cool? Am I not cool, right? And 14 to 21 is more about like, okay, what's my role in this world? What am I going to do here, right? Who I should be when I grow up. And then 21 to 28, you actually find your place in society a little bit. 28 to 35 is that next thing of, okay, cool, now what? What am I going to do with this? Eventually, suddenly you're like, okay, now I've achieved all this. Who am I in all this? And you have your midlife awakening or midlife crisis, right? So I think there's this natural progression that happens. And, in some ways we have a lot of stunted people, right? Because we also lost some of the rituals that used to be there, right? If you think, for example, nearly all Maggot Mead did some research on that. Nearly every older civilization had, for example, initiatory rituals for men. Right? There was a role at some point when you were ready to become a man, and that meant you get to drop your boyish bullshit and you get to take responsibility for society around you. Now we've lost this in our current cultural operating system, and you can tell there's a lot of people who are behaving like young boys or like 14-year-old teenagers who I like this, I don't like this, boom, boom, ha, put you on it, send some rockets, whatever, right? That's teenage behavior, right? And we've actually not done the work of continuing this path of individuation. Right, and so this is where we have all kinds of knowledge now. We're actually drowning in knowledge, but we're lacking wisdom, because as you said, Baiba, wisdom comes from experience, comes from having your face kicked in at some point in a meeting and being like, "Oh fuck, I just totally ruined this meeting and I completely lost this gig." And you have to have these kind of experiences in order to mature to that level. Right? I mean, you mentioned I'm a monk. I mean, I spent decades, right, meditating, looking at my own belly button, wondering about life, and doing all this shit, and I'm still an idiot. And if you think about how little people have time for this, right? When you think about personal development, that's like the book you buy at the airport, some self-help book you buy at the airport bookstore. But most people, go to school, go into their career, work, then they start making families, and there's family and kids and work, and family and kids and work, and before they know it, they are old, and this is their life. Right? Maybe they have an empty nester moment or something and find a second spring, or, do some, meditation retreat when they're 50, what I mean? Because they've had their midlife crisis. And then they do this developmental work. And to some extent, it's also been looked at as luxury. Right? I mean, even we had this funny little story about hard skills versus soft skills, right? A lot of time when I go into organizations, they look at what I do and they're like, "Oh, yeah, that's nice, soft skills. We'll do that when we have some extra budget. It's nice for the ladies." And I get those kind of things from managers where I'm saying, dude, do you not realize that you are dealing with a bunch of humans in your organization? And if we want this large scale change to work, if you want systemic change to work, you also need, human transformation. It's not a nice to have. It's actually essential. And I think really at the moment as humanity, we have grown up from, the different, hunter-gatherer tribes to the first agricultural, kingdoms that we have, the big matriarchies, 30,000 years ago, to the last few thousand years of this patriarchal system, where the accumulation of it was, the height of it is this information and I think, therefore I am. Right, and now I'm so cool. I'm building machines that can think who I am, right? And I'm in LLMs, and you see a lot of this in the lore of Silicon Valley and the current billionaire crew, right? There's this very mechanistic view of humans, right? And it's that rational circuit, and it's not a bad thing per se, but it's very limited because you do ultimately need to go to a self-developmental stage. And Robert Keegan, who I wrote a beautiful book called Immunity to Change, because I was looking why do these transitions and transformations fail in organizations. He found that 65% of adults in the US, that is, it's a weird population, not even the global population, 65% of adults are still in a socialized phase or below, meaning that they're still looking to some external authority or some external person to tell them if they're okay or not.
Yeah.
And only about 35% have reached a self-offering stage, meaning they have their own values, they act from their own values, they're conscious of the fact that they're making choices, but they don't do things because they have to or must or want to or should do, but because they choose to. Right? There's only 35% of the adult population, and only 1% is actually on a self-transformational level, meaning that they're actively transforming themselves. Right? And so right now, with technology having caught up to this socialized level, right, because it's ultimately what an LLM is, right? It's a perfect little socialized citizen, right, with all the knowledge that you should be having, right? And it gives you the answer you should be giving, right, in terms of probabilities. And so now we have technology that's caught up to this level. Now we actually need people who are one step further, because otherwise you just fodder for the AI, right? And so we need people who are self-authoring. And so while on the one hand, it does take time to develop, I think it's also important to really set that up properly, because we can accelerate that individuation process, and we just haven't had a need to, because our current education systems are focused on socialized beings, right? And creating the good little factory worker who can pull the right levers, and the good little consumer who can buy all these extra products that we actually don't need, right? But you guys are selling and helping to sell, right? But this is the stage that we've gotten people to. But we now need this, which was originally the aim behind public education. Was when you look at the Age of Enlightenment and Humboldt and all these people who kind of pushed for this, they actually said it's not about a job training. Education should be forming character and should be getting people in touch with their values and who they really are. But it's kind of at the same time factories came about, so that kind of went out the window as soft skills. And instead of that, we now have job training, essentially education. Right? And that's where I think it's actually urgent that we update people, and that we really look at how can we really invite on a mass level people to take that next step.
Mm. We framed the conversation around transformation through translation, and that translation piece, we know, is something you've done over many decades, from, in some cases, ancient arcane systems, some of the oldest documents in the world, and helping connect dots and find threads. But translation always involves some loss or some potential for distortion or even oversimplification. How do you know when translation is clarifying an idea versus changing its meaning altogether?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think ultimately, if it becomes applicable, if it becomes useful, right? I mean, for me, it's in the end, even with all this old stuff, there's a lot of bullshit in there, right? And a lot of it is coded language, and a lot of it is, superstition. And so to really look at what can I take into the modern world, what makes sense of this old stuff to apply here, for me, it's applicability, right? It's really the, how do I use it? Does it help me in the moment? Right? And not you do this, right? But in terms of like the crossover, right? Because even I think in our last talk, we talked a little bit about the left and right brain half and that model. And obviously it's a model, and all models are wrong. Some are useful, as George Box said, right? But I have this left brain, which is more around linear structure and focusing and, linearity and logic and all these things. And I have my right brain, which is more intuitive and open and artistic and creative, right? And really, the part that sits in the middle is actually one of the most important parts in our brain. Is the corpus callosum. And the job of the corpus callosum is to translate between these two, to connect the two hemispheres so that they're both firing. So I'm not stuck in either or. Right? And if you look at the people in your life, you probably have, right brain types who are a little artistic and have super cool creative ideas and are super fun, but they can't figure out how to budget their balance sheet every month. You know what I mean? And on the other hand, you have people who are super nerdy and can, show you all the data and the spreadsheets and all the logic and all this thing, but they don't have a creative idea in their body. And the key is to actually have both, right? And if you think about, for example, yoga, there's a lot of movements that are purposely crossing over, right? Even if you do this, for example, even you're just doing this, right? Or this, this, like this, I mean, anything that's like crossover actually activates the corpus callosum and helps you translate better. And I think this is what you're trying to do with your podcast. And in some ways, you're like the corpus callosum of branding here, right? Bringing together these different sides, right? Bringing together the more intuitive, emergent side of branding, where you're kind of picking up on signals and you're not even sure where it's coming from. You might be reading body language or feeling emotions, or just it's a movie you saw last night and the thing that you saw on the street this morning that somehow connects something in your brain. And suddenly you're like, wow, that's a fucking great idea, right? And then there's the other side that says, okay, and cool, here's a spreadsheet of 2 million people, data, blah, 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 that we evaluated. And both have valid points, right? Both are important. It's neither either or. And I think what you're trying to do is creating this connection between them so we can translate to each other. And language is always a risk, right? Because for me, language is guided hallucination. Right? If I say to you, don't think about an elephant, what are you going to do? It's going to be an elephant in your head, right? But your elephant and Baiba's elephant and my elephant might look completely different. right? Somebody might have a little pink cartoon elephant in their head. Some might see a more typical, real, natural elephant. Maybe it's an African elephant. Maybe it's an Indian elephant. So I don't really know what's happening in your brain, right? And so it's always an approximation. It's always a guess. It's always something that in the end, only the proof is in the pudding. Only the actual application will show, right? And if it's useful, awesome. If it's not useful, try something else. Right? And I think this is really the key here. Instead of saying, I know this is going to be 100% right, or I know this is going to be 100% right, to say, both is data, both is information. And information, knowledge only turns into wisdom once I actually do something with it, right? When I test it, when I bring it into real life, right? And because the best ideas, the best frameworks, the best beautiful PowerPoint presentation for branding, whatever, can still fall short once you show it to the first customer and they say, I don't get it. Mm.
We are working with the concept also about the translation. For me, a big question is that a lot of people, as we know, they are kind of like they want to be stuck, or they are stuck on only this kind of like one side of the coin, or they love this certainty around the topics. And what we are kind of offering is to keep the paradox open, or kind of like, to see these both sides. What would be your suggestion for those who are just kind of like starting to think about this journey? To kind of how to open their mind that, hey, there may be even another kind of like side of the story.
Deep compassion. I think really the deep compassion with self, right? Coming back to, we're all incredibly flawed human beings, and none of us knows what's going on. And this is a little bit of why people avoid going to this relational level, right? Because I is the most terrifying, most lonely word there is, right? Because as soon as you say I, everything else is not I, right? Everything else is something else, right? And when you realize, coming back to translation, when you realize this is why most of my, a lot of my friends are expats, right? Or people who are at least bilingual, right? Because they suddenly realize that things are not what they are. Right? Like when I grew up, this thing in front of me was called a tish, and this was called a tasse, and this was called a glass, right? And this is what it was until I came into a different country and suddenly it was la table or mezza or table and cup and different words for it. And I realized that, oh shit, I don't know what's going on. Everything that I know, I've been taught. Right? I don't know what is real. And this goes back to that, creating safety for yourself. Right? This is why I start with compassion, right? Because our brain hates uncertainty. Our brain wants to know, right? And especially actually our emotions want to know what's what. Right? We want to have certainty. We want to know that we are safe. Right? Which is why this whole uncertainty is so stressful for us, because we don't know if we're going to be safe. And this is, in order to go to this next level, you have to accept all that fully. You have to accept that I have no clue what's going on. Right? If I take this phone here and I let it go, it will probably fall down with 9.81 meters per second. Very, very likely. Super likely. Do I know that that's going to happen? No. Right? And this is the tricky part here. We have to be willing to accept that we have no idea what's going on, and that all of what we do is based on probabilities in some ways, right? And it's, I think, a little bit of an interesting shift. It takes about 100 years for a new idea to sink in. And if you think about Newtonian physics to quantum physics, it took about 100 years, and suddenly it's like in the mainstream now, right? With quantum this and quantum that, and we even have quantum computing now going on, right? But one of the big shifts that happened there was moving from certainty to managing probabilities. And I think when you're here, then you're managing probabilities. And you start with compassion for yourself, because I don't know what's going on, and that's okay. Right? I'm a flawed human being. I'm doing my very best to show up every day. I'm doing my very best to bring value into the world. And the more compassion I have for myself, the more compassion I have for everybody else. Right? If I can accept that I'm just on a path of learning too, and I'm just here and I'm just doing my best every day, then I can also look at other people and say, wow, they're complete idiots, but they're also just doing their best. You know what I mean? And I can really allow them their own process of development. And I think that's where I always start with compassion, is to really say, hey, we're all still trying to figure this out here. Nobody knows the truth. And if somebody comes and tells you they know the truth, run. You know what I mean? Go as fast as you can, because otherwise you might end up in a cult or something.
Yeah, you've just in, I don't know, a minute and a half there really hit so many of the points that are at the heart of so many of our conversations and the tension in our particular industry. The exhale and the realization that in fact the world is probabilistic and not deterministic is one of the core differentiators between, again, these two kind of competing belief systems or operating systems that exist in marketing, in the sense that, brands are built over quarter centuries, but meanwhile, the people who manage them are incentivized and graded over quarters. And so even when they accept that this is all a game of odds, their personal desire is to make something happen quickly over these next 12 weeks. And so then they reach for control buttons and levers to push and pull, and yet the things that they might be doing to make that happen might actually make the next quarter and the quarter after that harder now, given what they're doing now for themselves. Or worse, the things that they're doing will eventually pay out, but on a time scale that misses their own personal incentive system. So that trying to have people exhale and realize that the best you can do is increase the odds of your thing being chosen is both liberating and yet at the same time the problem, that they're dealing with on a quarterly basis. Many of these people are going to be listening to, this right now and and really feel seen in what I just said. What is the advice? Is there a different kind of exhales or a different kind of opening that they can tune into to help them, navigate that truth about the world?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it comes back to what we started with, this job as a midwife, right? I think in some ways you are all that, right? If you're working in branding, you're not just, coming up with a cool new campaign for your brand. You're really trying to bring them into the future, also ideally in a big picture, right? And then really looking at the longer term development here and really setting up a brand. I think I used it in my last talk, but I always just use that as a beautiful example when Nestle tried to introduce coffee to Japan, right? And it failed miserably because they're all just like, do we drink tea here? What are you bringing me coffee here? What did they do in the end? They created coffee flavored candy for kids. And they knew it was going to take 10, 15, 20 years until that sinks in. But now coffee is a very popular thing in Japan suddenly, right? It worked. And I think what, we can do as a brand person, and this is, I guess, where you're midwives of also these executives that have the quality focus, right, is to not just give them a cool brand campaign, but also help them with their own personal narrative around who they're going to be. Who do they need to be to weather those next 2, 3 quarters that maybe don't look so good? Because they need a story to tell their board and their investors and all these stakeholders that they have that they're responsible towards. Right. So it's not just the campaign itself, but to some extent you're actually coaching them around their own aspiration, right? And their who they could become. Right, because I think this is actually, and this is coming back to our current systems are built for this short-term thinking, short-term incentivizing, right? And this will not change until we have a certain amount of leaders who say, I am going to do something else. I'm going to do something more. Right? And if you look at the greater leaders or the bigger leaders in our history in the last years that have actually really turned around companies, they haven't just looked at short-term profit, right? They have played the long game. They have understood that if I want to turn something around, like even like, take, Satya Nadella, for example, who really turned around at Microsoft, right? And one of the first things he did was he actually brought the colleagues in from I forget the institute's name, but he taught a bunch of growth mindset classes, right? And so essentially everybody at Microsoft got a growth mindset class, right? And that was the beginning because he realized that he can't bring in all these other cultural changes and systemic changes until he has people who have more of a growth mindset. Right? And so I think this is really, really understanding yourself as brand strategists, right? Your work is not just the cool campaign. It's not just, pulling together the data with the intuition and all these other things, right? That's the first big step that you have to do in yourself is to say, okay, cool, I'm going to play both sides here. I'm going to, on the one hand, figure out my gut situation. On the other hand, I am going to go look at data and analyze this thing properly. And I'm going to bring both of those things into my world as I'm developing this. But then I'm not just presenting that to people. I also get to coach my customers around who they want to become and who they can become. Because otherwise they're going to, default to the quarterly KPIs because that's what they've been trained to do for decades, right? And so they also need your support in thinking bigger and having, this is one of the things you do well, is tell stories, right? And so when you think about these narratives, what are the narratives that are inspiring to them, right? Where they can see themselves as who they could become in a year or two if this thing succeeds. To some extent, is also how can you create little things that ultimately tell a bigger story over the long picture, on the long run, right? How can you slip in something that makes them happy for the quarter, right? While you're also setting them up for longer term success.
I want to go back to your article. The article was phenomenal. And even this thought that you also mentioned at the beginning of this conversation about archetypes and also about the initiation process, personal initiation process. And your soul's choice to incorporate or, become Sophie or Sophia. And when I read those lines, I was like, there aren't that many people who understand, first of all, archetypes, and they understand the meaning behind what you wrote in your article. And I was like, this article is fascinating just because it's so coded. There are so many symbols, there are so many layers. And if someone who is reading your article, and if they understand the context, then that article is a masterpiece. So my question for you, how did this happen? Because there was a very short introduction that it happened in a business school. You needed to you needed to kind of limit your choice. What are the most important things in your life? But this is, I think, something bigger.
Well, I mean, honestly, to start with, privilege. And this is a conversation I've had with a friend of mine a lot about conscious development and developing yourself. It's a tremendous privilege. You know what I mean? Because the majority of humans on this planet, they're worried about having a handful of rice every day to feed their family. And if you have that, you're maybe not going to spend a few hours sitting around meditating. You know what I mean? So I think, I grew up with a tremendous privilege. I had these two forces in my life. I've had a dad who was a doctor, and he was very, man of science and very rigorous and very disciplined. And, from him, I got into leadership books when I was 12, and I started reading that stuff because he was into it. And it was one of my connections with him. Because of him, I got into computers and I learned about programming and, all these different things. So, and at the same time, he was also someone who, loves to draw and, loves art and appreciates art, but it's not to say something he does, it's more something that he appreciates. And then I had my mom, who was more practical in life, and I learned cooking from her, and then, made art with her all the time, and she took me to art exhibits. And when I was 13 for my birthday, she gave me a stick welder. So I, ended up, making sculptures out of metal and steel. So I've had the privilege of, being an artist as a kid. I mean, I drew, I learned from my dad how to do photography in a dark room. I danced, I played music. I, had all these things available to me. Right, and I had, my dad's library available to me. When I was 12, I started reading books that were far beyond my age. I mean, even he gave me Schopenhauer's aphorism for life wisdom for my confirmation, which I thought was hilarious. That, for my confirmation, he's giving me Schopenhauer, which, pretty much immediately destroyed any sort of association with the Christian church, and I became a nihilist for a couple of years. This was tremendous privilege. I mean, I had a really good education. Even I grew up in Germany, and in the school where I was at, it was a fairly affluent region in South Germany. There was awesome teachers. I had some really phenomenal teachers. I learned Latin in school. I had a Latin teacher who was really, really, and a later German teacher was really into looking into etymology and really looking into words, and taught me this whole like fascination for words. Right. I had a wonderful other German teacher who taught us about that we can take any side, and made us write essays with the opposite of our opinion, so that we would learn how to do that. Right. So there's been a lot of sort of circumstantial and beautiful things that kind of gave me an education for the future. I mean, and then when I was in business school, and I had that moment when I chose that really the most important thing to me is is learning, is studying, is growing, is developing my consciousness. Even that was a privilege, I mean, and even in the time when I was close to homeless, the reason why I wasn't, and I think the difference there between home free and homeless is that I still had a tremendous community around the world that I could, call up and find a couch to sleep on. And I think I also, of course, built that community, and it was my social capital that I expended there. But even that was privilege through the years that I've had to set me up like this. So I think I have to first and foremost acknowledge that a lot of it came from privilege. I mean, this is not something that a normal, working class household that has to survive on two job salaries, whatever, can necessarily afford on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at any spiritual tradition or most spiritual traditions, they have a separation between the monk life and the layman life. Right? And there's, the monks who go in deep and they, spend the hours meditating and they spend the hours in prayer and they spend the hours of all that stuff. And then you have layman. And layman doesn't mean that you don't do any of that stuff. It means, how can I find moments in my daily life to still have moments of mindfulness? Right? Like, for example, years ago, I wrote an article on morning rituals. And for me, how you start your morning is so important, right? How you set up your day, right? Because if most people wake up and it's like, meh, 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 and say, oh shit, snooze, meh, 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 snooze, meh, meh, meh. And then they run in the shower, get bloody real quick, and they're already late for work, and they're running, everybody is an idiot traffic because they're all in their way, and they get to the office and they're like, ah, and they all have like 15 emails already in their head, and they run all day, come home at night, and they're like, oh, what happened today? And what happened to my life 30 years later? Right? And when you actually even take 2 minutes in the morning to say, oh, good morning, me. Good morning. How am I doing today? What's happening for me today? What do I want to create today? What's my day like today? Right? And even taking a few moments in the morning. When a friend who said that I would love to do yoga in the morning, but I don't have time with the kids and everything. I said, just do it. And so she started doing yoga, and at first a little 2-year-old was like crawling on her leg while she's doing yoga, you know what I mean? And at some point, the little one sat next to her and mimicked her and tried to do yoga with her. And now they do yoga together every morning, you know what I mean? So you can make that time. And this is because it's easy again for me to say, I'm a monk, I have no family, and have plenty of time to sit and think and meditate. But even if you don't, even if you have a full life, even if you have a family, even if you have all that stuff going on, take a few moments for yourself, and take those few moments in the morning. And then even one of the things I suggest to people too is set an alarm once an hour, and once an hour have your phone go off and just do a quick check-in with yourself. What am I sensing right now? What am I feeling right now? Have I been thinking about? Which relationships are important to me right now? How am I using my voice, my genius, my vision? Okay, it takes 10 seconds. I mean, you don't have to have a ton of time. And even there's studies that show that meditating a few times per day, even a few minutes throughout the day, is ultimately more effective than meditating for an hour in the morning. Right? Because you might meditate for an hour in the morning and you're like, oh, all zened out. And then you open your phone and you get your first emails and you're right back in it. Right? And so instead of that, to keep having short 2-minute, 5-minute moments throughout the day, will remind you of, who do I want to be? Right? What kind of person do I want to be right now, in this next meeting, in this next email that I'm writing? Right? And to just check in more often. And I think that's something that everybody can do. I think take the time as much as you can, wherever you can. And really, I think, remember the importance of your lifetime. I think that's what it really comes down to, right? Because we try and push death away a little bit, especially when you're young, we don't think about it much, and you're like, I can party forever, it's like, yeah, and eventually you're like, oh, this hurts, and that hurts, and oh, my hair's gone, and suddenly you realize you're old, right? And I know I've already spent more moments than I'm going to be spending, right? So every moment is also becoming more and more precious. And I'm going to make sure that I use my moments wisely, because there's less and less of them. And because of that, by very nature, they become more important and more precious. And I think that to realize that we will die one day, and to accept that fully, and to then embrace, to say, okay, cool, who do I want to have been then? And how can I in every moment orient myself on that? Right? And that's something anybody can do, right? No matter where you're at.
For someone listening or watching right now who is tuned in to what you're saying, and if you had to give them some advice, maybe even just for 60 seconds to find a way to kind of tune out, what would you tell them to do right now?
A comfortable position, find your feet on the ground, right? And actually just feel your feet, like the front, the back, the left, the right, all four sides of it, right? Because when you find your feet on the ground, it signals to your brain, I'm not dead yet, right? So very helpful, right? And simply finding your feet on the ground, taking a deep breath in, and a long breath out, I'm gonna do this a couple of times, like think about what's the best version of me. Those moments when I felt fully accomplished, fully like I just rocked something, I just created something that I'm proud of. I seen all the smiley faces around me because of what I did. That's what I can be. And I can also be self-critical, I can be an ass, I can be an idiot. It's also true. But what do I want to focus on right now? That first part, that felt better. Let's do that. Simple, right? Doesn't take much. Just orient yourself on who you want to become one day, want to have been one day. And remember that you're here right now.
Is there anything that we need to plug in the end? Because we also we are mentioning like, hey, follow Philip on LinkedIn or read his Medium blog, or is there anything else I don't know that you want to mention?
And obviously, my website at philiphorvath.com or my LinkedIn profile, feel free to, share those, and always happy to, meet more people and learn more from them. If you know somebody who is in transformation and struggling with that, also, of course, call me. Happy to support people with that because that's what I'm here to do. And other than that, I'm just, grateful for the work that you're doing. I think it's really super important to have translators, to have people who help make meaning in this world, because it's easy to get lost here or somewhere else, right, in these different ways. And I think it's super important to have people that bring these worlds together and help us, especially in these times of transformation when this post-truth world and all that stuff, right? If you're in this world right now, to have people who are willing to have those conversations, to show up, to take different perspectives and figure out how can we integrate them maybe, I think that's an important thing to do. So for me, just to say, please keep telling great stories out there. And for all the people who do branding, keep remembering that you're not just peddling a product here or a brand, you're really creating culture with what you do, right? And what kind of future do you want to create with the work that you're doing?
I think this is at least the fourth time we've had a chance to be in Philip's presence. And one of the things that I was able to observe again here is despite some of the very deep and heavy things that were being discussed, we always had smiles on our faces. And in all the other screens that we've been on recently, or physically in rooms, at least 50% of the time that we've experienced you have been physically in the room, there have been smiles on faces. And it's not just the content and the substance, but it's the way in which you send that signal that I think is very unique and special. So do encourage people to find you and your writings, and to get in touch with you if they need more of your help physically. So yeah, please seek out Philip Horvath to the best of your ability. And thank you so much for your time. I know it's the one thing we don't get back in life. And thus, you spending it with us here in brandLingual is very, very special.
Well, you're well worth your attention. And I always said the easiest way to make the world better is smile. Right? Because when you smile, there's these little nerve endings here that signal to your brain that you're okay. Right. So if you even like feel bad and you force yourself to do this, you actually feel better. And when you walk around with a smile, because we're mirroring creatures, people will smile back at you by default. And they feel better too. Right. So keep on smiling too, because it makes the world a better place.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.